coming out on a nice late fall, early winter Friday evening. Sacrifice your Friday evening for this. I'm particularly pleased because I realized 2 days ago that the illustrious Dr. P.Z. Myers is helping to promote this lecture. I wonder if Dr. Myers is here. Great. Good. Thank you for coming. Good to see you. America's own Richard Dawkins. We're pleased and honored to have you here. And your friends. Just held a party for 3 years. That's fun. Come. Okay. Earlier this year was a centennial that very few people, unfortunately, know about, and people didn't really mark. It was a centennial of the world's first forced sterilization law. It was signed in early March 1907, and it was passed not in Nazi Germany or Soviet Union or some other place, but in the state of Indiana. 2 years later, in 1909, my home state of Washington State, along with California, followed suit, and Connecticut, passing forced sterilization laws. In 1925, the state of Minnesota followed suit and passed a forced sterilization law. And by 1960, more than 60,000 Americans had been sterilized against their will as part of the name of a movement done, at least in the name of science, known as eugenics, and that sought to really breed better human beings on the principles of Darwinian biology, which is what was taught to be the principles of Darwinian biology. Unfortunately, most average people today know next to nothing about this terrible chapter in American history, and those who do know something about it, I think, misunderstand the ideology that drove it. Eugenics, what's that? Better living through better breeding? That sounds like the stuff of science fiction, not the stuff of the real world. Forced sterilization, isn't that the stuff that the Nazis did? It's often said that those who don't learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And so this presentation is offered in the hope that we can learn something from history so that we don't repeat past mistakes. So what we're going to do tonight is talk, here's sort of outline. We're going to talk about understanding the ideology that I think drove eugenics, at least part of it, the impact of eugenics on public policy, and then the lessons for democracy. I'm a political scientist, and so I'm interested in how this plays out in the political and social realm, and what relevance can we take from this if we use it sort of as a case study of some things that we might want to think about today for various debates. So, trying to understand what eugenics is, I think let's start out with the guy who is usually credited with starting it, Francis Galton, who's Charles Darwin's cousin, generally recognized as the founder of the eugenics movement, actually coined the term, adapted from a Greek root word meaning good in birth, and really, you could define it, I guess, as the science of improving human beings through breeding. Positive eugenics was known as efforts to get the best people to breed more. Of course, that presumes you know who the best people are. We'll talk about that, yes. Negative eugenics, which tended to have more impact, at least how this played out in the political sphere in America, were efforts to control the breeding of those regarded as inferior classes. Of course, that raised the question, well, who is inferior and why? And today, if you go around the internet or even read some scholarly things and some not so scholarly books, and you try to find out the question, so how did this come about? What was sort of the ideological premise of eugenics? And you get different answers. But one answer that you get a lot of is that one thing we're sure of, that Darwin and sort of Darwinian biology had nothing to do with it. And you find that a lot. In a book published a couple of years ago called War Against the Weak, a guy named Edwin Black wrote saying Darwin was writing about a natural world distinct from man, while other thinkers were the ones to blame for distilling the ideas of Malthus, Spencer, and Darwin into this new concept known as social Darwinism. And that Darwin really had nothing to say about human society and how natural selection should apply to that. Well, we'll see if that's true. On a taxpayer-funded website, funded by the National Science Foundation, to help teachers how to teach actually about evolution. We'll think about the history of science. And this is the cartoon from that. And you can sort of see the tenor of it. You have Mr. Darwin in his beard and outside of his house, yelling, "Get out of my house!" to Mr. Laissez-faire and Mr. Eugenics. The idea here is that laissez-faire capitalism, or certainly eugenics, had nothing to do with Darwin. In fact, he'd be irate. "Get out of my house! It's contaminating my theory." And that's, again, to teach teachers what they should tell students about the history of eugenics. Well, around the world right now is going a very prestigious museum display that was based out of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And this is from the website that they developed describing it when it initially debuted a couple of years ago. Now it's sort of going to different places around the world. Earlier in the year it was in Philadelphia, and that's not still there. And this talked about the distortions of social Darwinism. And said, Darwin passionately opposed social injustice and oppression. He would have been dismayed to see anything that happens. His theory used to promote unbridled capitalism, and particularly to use to justify racism or eugenics. And that this is a gross misreading of the ideas first described in the Origin of Species and applied in modern biology. That makes some really interesting claims, some of which I agree with, some of which, as you'll find out, I don't. It may well be true that Darwin would have been dismayed at the way his theories were used and played out, because personally he was a kindly man, and it's certainly true that he was against anything like slavery. It's a different question to say whether logically those people who thought they were applying Darwin really were twisting his theories and misapplying them, or a gross misreading of his theories. And we'll see what Darwin has to say about that when we look at a book called The Descent of Man, which is where he put what he thought his theory meant as applied to human society, which is a book too little read today. Now, sometimes, in asking the question, where did eugenics come from? This is from another website that was, I think, got some National Institutes of Health money, and allied with a place called Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is going to figure in tonight's story, which, in fact, was in the news just a few weeks ago because of some rather controversial comments by Nobel Prize-winning biologist James Watson. But we're going to learn tonight about the founding director of Cold Spring Harbor. But this was a document that was put out to teach about a case called Buck versus Bell, which we'll also talk about tonight, that was upheld forced sterilization in America. And this whole article, part of it was about, well, where did eugenics come from? Although Darwin's name isn't actually mentioned once in the article, this is the explanation again. Eugenics was based on the biblical concept that like breeds like, to which eugenics researchers provide a scientific gloss. So yes, all the evils of the modern world we know do go back to the Bible, so therefore eugenics must as well. I think needless to say that I disagree with these things. I think this is a gross misreading of the historical record. Sort of a cleansing of the historical record, really gross revisionism. When you go back to the people who founded eugenics and tried to apply it, at least in America, which is my area of expertise, they were not, for the most part, spouting the Bible. Some did because the scientists tried to enlist, particularly theological modernists, into it in the latter part of the sort of eugenics crusade. But they were citing Darwin, not the Bible, for the most part. And so and in fact, it was society's violation of natural selection that really concerned them. And where did they get this? Well, listen to this passage from Darwin's Descent of Man.
With savages, the weak in body and mind are soon eliminated. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to